I was 79 the first time my daughter knocked on my door on Christmas morning. Not with a gift, but with a manila folder thick with legal documents. 12 years of silence, and this brought her back. My signature on a mortgage application. I stood there in my flannel robe, snow swirling behind her, watching Nadine shift from one expensive boot to the other, like she was still that sullen teenager who couldn't wait to escape. Her hair was shorter now, streaked with silver she probably paid money to hide, but her eyes held the same guarded look I remembered. "Mom," she said, and the word sounded foreign. But why now, after years of silence, would she finally come home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The manila folder felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper should be. It held weight beyond ink and bureaucracy. It carried 12 years of silence, of birthdays unmarked by phone calls, of Mother's Days that passed like any other Tuesday. I invited them in because that's what you do when your daughter shows up, on Christmas morning, even if she arrives with a stranger who introduced himself as her fiancé and paperwork that needed my signature. "Coffee?" I asked because politeness is armor, and I needed protection. "That would be lovely," Colin said. He had kind eyes and an easy smile, the sort of man who probably called his own mother every Sunday. I wondered what Nadine had told him about me, about us. Nothing good, I suspected. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and vanilla from the Christmas cookies I'd baked the day before, more out of habit than hope. For 12 years I'd continued the rituals of a family Christmas. The tree in the living room. The stockings hung by the fireplace. The feast for one that I'd eat in careful portions over the following week. Hope, I'd learned, dies hard in a mother's heart. My daily routine had become as predictable as sunrise. 6:30 alarm, though I rarely needed it anymore. Age had trained my body to wake with the first hint of dawn. Coffee first, always, standing. At the kitchen window watching the light creep across the snow-covered fields that stretched behind our property. Ray used to say I was solar-powered, that I couldn't function until I'd absorbed my daily dose of morning light. The newspaper arrived by 7, thrown with impressive accuracy onto my front porch by Tommy Breslin, who'd taken over the route from his older brother 15 years ago. I read it cover to cover, including the classifieds and the agricultural reports that hadn't applied to my life since Ray retired from teaching, and we'd given up our small vegetable garden. But routine is comfort when you live alone, and the newspaper was a window into a world that continued spinning whether I participated or not. Breakfast was simple. Toast with homemade strawberry jam, sometimes an egg if I felt ambitious. I'd stopped cooking elaborate meals for one person years ago, though I still baked every week. The act of measuring and mixing, the alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into something nourishing, remained one of my deepest pleasures. Plus, Dorothy always appreciated fresh cookies when she stopped by for our afternoon tea. "Your home is beautiful," Colin said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs that had hosted decades of family meals back when we were still a family. "Nadine's told me so much about growing up here." I caught the look my daughter shot him. Sharp, warning. Whatever she'd told him, it hadn't been the whole truth. The whole truth was messier than the stories we tell to make ourselves look better. The kitchen was the heart of this house, just as it had been when I was raising Nadine and supporting Ray through his teaching career. The same butcher block counters where I'd rolled out thousands of pie crusts. The same gas stove that had produced countless family dinners. The same round oak table where we'd gathered each evening to share the day's news. Ray would grade papers, while I cleaned up and Nadine would do homework or practice piano. Back when she still played piano before she decided it was boring and uncool. Ray's teaching certificate hung in a frame by the kitchen window, yellowed with age but still proud. 43 years he'd taught at the local high school, shaping young minds while I shaped our home, our daughter, our life together. I'd had plans once, dreams of my own classroom, my own students. But life has a way of requiring choices, and I'd chosen family. Mostly, I'd never regretted it. When I was 24 and newly married, I'd been accepted into the graduate education program at the state university. I had dreams of teaching high school literature, of sharing my love for books with teenagers who might discover their own passion for words. Ray was supportive, proud even. "My brilliant wife," he'd say, showing off my acceptance letter to anyone who'd listen. But then Nadine came along, unplanned but not unwanted, and graduate school suddenly seemed impossible. Daycare was expensive, and Ray's starting salary barely covered our mortgage. Someone needed to be home with the baby, and that someone, by default, became me. Just for a few years, we told ourselves, until she starts school. By the time Nadine entered kindergarten, Ray was working on his master's degree in education administration, and I was the one supporting him through late-night study sessions and comprehensive exams. By the time he finished, I was pregnant again, a pregnancy that ended in miscarriage at 4 months, leaving me hollow and grieving, and somehow even more convinced that my job was to tend the home fires while Ray conquered the professional world. "Mom taught 8th grade before I was born," Nadine said, and I was surprised she remembered. "She was going to go back when I started school, but—" She trailed off, the sentence hanging unfinished like so many conversations between us. But Ray needed support during his master's program, but money was tight. But someone needed to be home when Nadine got sick with strep throat every winter. But, the architecture of a woman's life built on the word, but. "I went back when you turned 16, I said, surprising myself with the defensiveness in my voice. "Taught for 8 years until your father, until he got sick." Those 8 years had been some of the happiest of my adult life. Finally, I had my own classroom, my own students, my own professional identity beyond Ray's wife and Nadine's mother. The pay was modest, but the satisfaction was immense. I taught 8th grade English, and I was good at it. Really good. I had a gift for reaching the difficult kids, the ones who'd given up on themselves and needed someone to believe in their potential. My students called me Mrs. L, and they trusted me with their stories, their struggles, their secret dreams of becoming something more than their circumstances suggested they could be. I kept letters they'd written me over the years, updates on graduations and marriages and career achievements. In a drawer in my bedroom, I still had thank you notes from students who credited me with helping them discover their love of reading or writing. When Ray got sick, I took early retirement to care for him. It seemed like the right choice. The only choice, really. He needed me, and our marriage had been built on the understanding that we took care of each other. I'd expected to go back after he recovered, but his recovery never came, and by the time he died, I was 67 and tired and no longer sure I had the energy to start over again. The coffee maker gurgled and sputtered, filling the silence that followed. These were dangerous waters we were wading into, the undercurrents of old resentment still strong enough to pull us under. Colin cleared his throat. "Nadine tells me you're an amazing quilter. She's always talking about the quilts you made her when she was little." This was news to me. In all our years of silence, I'd wondered if she even remembered those quilts. I'd spent hours cutting fabric into precise squares, piecing together patterns that would outlast childhood, would become family heirlooms. The hope was that someday she'd wrap her own children in those quilts, tell them stories about their grandmother who chose each color with care. Quilting had become my salvation after Ray died. The repetitive nature of the work, cutting, piecing, stitching, was meditative, calming. The quilting circle at church provided social connection without requiring deep emotional investment. We met every Thursday afternoon in the church basement, 6 women of various ages bound together by thread and needle, and the shared understanding that creating something beautiful with your hands was both humble and profound. Dorothy Kimball was the unofficial leader of our group, though she'd never claimed the title. She was the one who organized our schedules, suggested new patterns, and gently corrected mistakes without making anyone feel foolish. She'd been quilting for 60 years, since her own mother taught her as a girl, and her skill level was intimidating until you realized how generous she was with her knowledge. "They're still upstairs," I said. "In her room." Nadine's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, or something softer. "You kept my room?" Of course I'd kept her room. What mother doesn't keep her child's room like a shrine to possibility? For 12 years I'd dusted the furniture she'd painted black in her Gothic phase, straightened the books she'd abandoned when she left for college, kept the window open, just a crack, because she'd always complained about the stuffiness. Every week I'd vacuum the carpet where her feet would never again pad across in sock feet, asking what was for dinner. The room was exactly as she'd left it the day she moved to Boston for her first job. The desk where she'd written high school essays still held her pencil cup filled with dried-up pens. The bulletin board was covered with photos of friends I barely remembered, concert tickets from bands that had probably broken up, acceptance letters from colleges she'd ultimately rejected. The bed was made with the same blue-flowered comforter she'd chosen when she turned 14, and decided her childhood yellow was too babyish. Sometimes, when the loneliness got particularly heavy, I'd sit in that room and try to remember what it felt like when the house was full of life. The sounds of Nadine's music drifting from under her door, the thump of her feet on the stairs, the endless phone conversations with friends that seemed to be conducted in a secret language I didn't understand. Ray used to complain about the noise, but I'd loved it. Loved the evidence that our home was alive, vital, necessary. "Where else would I put your things?" I said, as if it was the most practical decision in the world instead of the desperate hope it actually was. The coffee finished brewing, and I busied myself with cups and cream, grateful for the ritual. My hands knew these movements. The careful pour, the clink of spoons against porcelain, the dance of hospitality I'd perfected over decades of being Ray's wife, the teacher's wife, the woman who made everyone feel welcome in her home. The china, cups I'd chosen were my good ones, the set Ray's mother had given me for our wedding. I didn't use them often anymore. What was the point of good china when you lived alone? But today felt like an occasion that warranted the effort. The cups were white with tiny pink roses around the rim, elegant in their simplicity, and they reminded me of Sunday dinners when Ray's parents were still alive, and our dining room table was full of conversation and laughter. "This house is exactly how I remembered it," Nadine said, and there was something in her voice I couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe, or regret. It was exactly how she'd remembered it, because I'd frozen it in time the day she left. The same floral wallpaper in the dining room, the same collection of ceramic roosters on the kitchen windowsill that Ray had thought were silly but never asked me to remove. The same needlepoint pillows on the sofa, the same family photos on the mantel. Though I'd stopped adding new ones after she stopped visiting. The house was a museum to a family that used to exist, and I was its sole curator. I'd considered redecorating over the years, updating the wallpaper or replacing the worn carpet in the living room. But every time I'd look at paint samples or flip through home decorating magazines, I'd be overwhelmed by the finality of change. As long as the house remained the same, I could pretend that Nadine might come home someday, that she'd want to find things exactly as she'd left them. Change felt like giving up hope, and I wasn't ready for that level of surrender. The living room still held the baby grand piano we'd bought when Nadine was 8, and begged for lessons. She'd been talented, with a natural ear for melody and nimble fingers that found the keys instinctively. For 3 years she'd practiced dutifully every afternoon after school, filling the house with scales and simple songs. Then adolescence. Hit and piano became another thing that marked her as different from her friends, another obligation that kept her from the social life she craved. The piano had been silent for 20 years, but I still kept it tuned. Harold Morrison came by twice a year with his tools and his trained ear, adjusting the strings and testing the keys. "Shame to let such a beautiful instrument go to waste," he'd say, and I'd nod and write him a check and tell myself it was practical maintenance, not wishful thinking. "Tell me about Boston," I said, settling into my chair across from them. It felt strange having voices in my kitchen again. For years, my only regular companion had been Dorothy from next door, and our conversations were comfortable grooves, worn smooth by familiarity. This felt jagged, uncertain. Dorothy had become my lifeline in the years after Ray's death. She'd lost her own husband, Frank, to a heart attack 3 years after Ray's cancer took him, and we'd bonded over the specific loneliness of widowhood. She understood the silence that followed a life shared, the way you'd still buy 2 pork, chops out of habit, the way you'd wake up in the morning and for just a moment forget that you were alone. We'd developed our own rhythm over the years. Dorothy came by most afternoons around 3 o'clock, after her soap opera ended, but before the evening news began. She'd bring her current quilting project and we'd sit in the living room with tea and whatever I'd baked that week, working with our hands while we caught up on neighborhood gossip and discussed the books we'd borrowed from the library. Dorothy was 75, 4 years younger than me, but infinitely more social. She knew everyone in town and everything that happened to them. She was the one who'd told me when the Methodist minister's wife left him for the organist, who'd brought casseroles when old Mrs. Patterson broke her hip, who'd organized the fundraiser when the Peterson family lost their house to fire. She was the kind of neighbor small towns are built on, and I was grateful every day that she'd chosen me as her primary confidant. "It's busy," Nadine said. "I work in marketing for a tech startup. We're doing really well." She straightened her shoulders when she said it, like she was proving something. "That's wonderful." I meant it, even if it hurt that I'd had to learn about her success from Christmas morning small talk instead of proud phone calls over the years. "And you two met at work?" Colin laughed. "Actually, we met at a coffee shop. Nadine was there with her laptop, working on some presentation, and I kept staring because she looked so intense and focused. Finally got up the courage to ask if she wanted a refill." "He was very persistent," Nadine said, and for a moment her face softened in a way I remembered from when she was little, before life taught her to guard herself so carefully. I could picture it. My driven daughter hunched over her computer in some trendy Boston cafe, probably wearing the kind of sleek business attire that signaled success and self-sufficiency. She'd always been focused when she set her mind to something, whether it was mastering a difficult piano piece or acing a chemistry test. As a child, she'd had an almost frightening intensity when she was interested in something, the ability to shut out the world and concentrate that both impressed and worried me. Had to be. She kept saying she was too busy to date, Colin reached over and squeezed her hand, and I saw her tense slightly at the public display of affection. She'd always been like that, even as a child, loving but cautious about showing it, as if emotions were currency she couldn't afford to spend. I wondered if that was my fault, if my own careful nature had taught her that feelings were luxuries rather than necessities. Ray had always been the demonstrative one, quick to hug and kiss and declare his love. I showed love through cooking and cleaning and remembering, through the small acts of service that kept a family running. Maybe that hadn't been enough. Growing up, Nadine had been affectionate in her own way, crawling into my lap for bedtime stories, holding my hand when we walked through town, bringing me dandelions she'd picked from the yard. But she'd also been independent, quick to assert her ability to do things herself, resistant to help even when she clearly needed it. I'd admired her self-reliance while secretly mourning the gradual distance it created between us. "How long have you been together?" I asked. 3 years, Colin said, and I finally wore her down enough to agree to marry me 6 months ago. I looked at Nadine's left hand and saw the ring for the first time. A simple solitaire that caught the morning light, streaming through the kitchen window. My daughter was engaged, and I was learning about it on Christmas morning from a stranger. "Congratulations," I said, and I hoped the word didn't sound as hollow as it felt. "That's wonderful news." "Thank you," Nadine said quietly. She twisted the ring on her finger. A nervous habit I didn't remember from her childhood, but recognized anyway. Funny how you can still read your child even after years of separation. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the conversations we should have had. I should have known about Colin, should have been there when he proposed, should have been planning a wedding instead of sitting here like a stranger in my own daughter's life. "So," I said because someone had to address it. "Tell me about this house you want to buy." Nadine reached for the manila folder and pulled out a glossy brochure, the kind real estate agents use for expensive properties. The cover photo showed a stunning lakefront home with floor-to-ceiling windows and a wraparound deck that seemed to float over the water. Even in the photograph, I could see this wasn't just a house. It was a statement. "It's on Lake Champlain," Nadine said, sliding the brochure across the table. "We found it 3 months ago and fell in love immediately." I opened the brochure and felt my breath catch. The asking price was printed in elegant script at the bottom of the first page. $850,000, nearly $1 million. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but the sum was staggering. Ray and I had bought this farmhouse for $12,000 in 1968, and even adjusting for inflation, I couldn't fathom spending such an amount on a home. "It's beautiful," I said, because it was. The interior photos showed gleaming hardwood floors, a kitchen with granite countertops that probably cost more than Ray's annual teaching salary, and a master bedroom with windows that opened directly onto the lake. It was the kind of house you saw in magazines, not the kind that real people lived in. "The location is perfect," Colin added enthusiastically. "It's only 40 minutes from Nadine's office, but it feels completely secluded. And the sunrise over the lake. We went there early one morning, and it was absolutely magical." I could hear the genuine excitement in his voice, the way couples get when they're planning their future together. It reminded me of how Ray and I had talked about this farmhouse all those years ago, though our dreams had been considerably more modest. We'd been thrilled by the prospect of 2 full bathrooms and a kitchen large enough for a proper dining table. "The thing is," Nadine said, and I heard her voice shift into what I recognized as her professional tone, crisp and controlled. "The mortgage company requires a co-signer, My income qualifies us for the loan, but Colin's employment history isn't quite what they want to see. I switched careers 2 years ago, Colin explained. I was in finance, but I hated it. Now I'm doing freelance graphic design, which I love. But the banks are nervous about the inconsistent income. I studied the brochure more carefully, noting details I'd missed on first glance. The house had been built in 2019, which meant it was practically new. The lot was 2 acres of prime lakefront property. The kitchen had professional-grade appliances and a wine refrigerator. This wasn't just a home. It was a lifestyle, a symbol of having made it in the world. What exactly would I be signing? I asked. Nadine pulled more papers from the folder, official-looking documents covered in dense legal text. You'd be guaranteeing the loan. It's really just a formality. My salary more than covers the monthly payments, and we have excellent credit. The bank just wants the additional security. Just a formality. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us wanted to examine too closely. After 12 years of silence, my signature on her mortgage was apparently worth more than my presence in her life. What happens if you can't make the payments? I asked. We can make the payments, Nadine said quickly. That's not going to be an issue. But what happens if you can't? I pressed. If one of you gets sick or loses your job or... Then you'd be responsible for the mortgage, Colin said gently. He seemed to understand that I needed the honest answer, not reassurance. $850,000. The number echoed in my head like a warning bell. If something went wrong, and in my experience, things often went wrong when you least expected them, I could lose this house, the home Ray and I had built together, the place where I'd raised my daughter and buried my husband and planned to live out the rest of my days. I need to think about this, I said. Of course, Colin said immediately. It's a big decision. But Nadine's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, a tell I remembered from her teenage years when she didn't get her way. Immediately. The offer expires January 2nd, she said. We need to move quickly if we want the house. There it was. The pressure, subtle but unmistakable. Come home after 12 years of silence, present me with legal documents on Christmas morning, and expect me to make a decision that could cost me everything within a week. It was so characteristic of the daughter I remembered, the one who planned her life in careful detail and expected everyone else to fall in line with her timeline. That's not very much time, I said. That's why we came as soon as we could, Nadine replied. I know it's been a while since we've talked. 12 years, I interrupted. It's been 12 years. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying the weight of every missed birthday, every holiday spent alone, every time I'd started to pick up the phone to call her, and then stopped, remembering that the silence was mutual, that she had my number too. Colin looked uncomfortable, as if he was witnessing something he shouldn't see. Maybe I should step outside, let you two talk privately. No, Nadine said quickly. This concerns you two. But I saw how she reached for his hand, how she needed his presence as a buffer between us. It stung, though I couldn't say I was surprised. I'd become a stranger to my own daughter, someone who required the mediation of a third party to make conversation possible. I'm curious, I said, trying to keep my voice level. In all these years, what made you think I'd be willing to do this? For you? The question seemed to catch Nadine off guard. She blinked, and for a moment she looked younger, less certain. You're my mother, she said finally, as if that explained everything. I'm your mother, who you haven't spoken to in 12 years, I pointed out. I'm your mother who didn't know you were engaged, who's never met Colin before today, who learned about your career and your life from 5 minutes of small talk. That goes both ways, Nadine said, and there was heat in her voice now. You never called me either. She was right, of course. The silence had been mutual, sustained by pride and hurt feelings, and the terrible inertia that builds up when communication breaks down. After the first year, calling had seemed impossible. After the 5th year, it had seemed pointless. After 12 years, it had become a way of life. You're right, I said. I didn't call, but I didn't come knocking on your door asking for favors, either. Colin cleared his throat gently. Maybe we could start over, he suggested. I know there's history here that I don't understand. But you're both important to each other. That's obvious. I wanted to laugh at his optimism, his belief that family bonds could be repaired with good intentions and honest conversation. He, came from a different world, apparently. One where families stayed connected and worked through their problems, instead of letting them fester in silence. What do you know about our history? I asked him. He glanced at Nadine, clearly uncomfortable. Not much, he admitted. Nadine said you two had a falling out when her father was sick, but she hasn't really talked about the details. Of course she hadn't. The details were ugly, painful, the kind of family trauma that doesn't translate well to new relationships. How do you explain to the man you love that you haven't spoken to your mother in over a decade? How do you describe the anger and guilt and stubborn pride that can drive a wedge between people who should be closest to each other? It was complicated, Nadine said quietly. Complicated. That was one word for it. Another word might be heartbreaking, or devastating, or the kind of wound that never quite heals, just scabs over and aches when the weather changes. I looked at the brochure again, at this beautiful house that represented everything my daughter had achieved without me. Her success, her independence, her ability to build a life that didn't include the woman who'd given birth to her and raised her and loved her fiercely, even when she didn't know how to show it. Why now? I asked. Why come to me now after all this time? Nadine met my eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. Because I need you, she said simply. And maybe I'm tired of pretending I don't. The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was quite ready to cross. Nadine's confession that she needed me, that she was tired of pretending she didn't, had surprised us both. I could see it in her face, the slight widening of her eyes, as if the words had escaped without her permission. Outside, the snow had intensified, fat flakes swirling past the kitchen window, in what was clearly becoming more than the light dusting the weather service had predicted. Colin noticed it too, glancing out with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read Vermont weather. That's coming down pretty hard, he said. I followed his gaze and felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. I'd lived in this house for over 50 years through countless storms, but being snowed in at 79 felt different than it had at 40. Everything felt more precarious now. My balance on icy steps, my ability to shovel the walkway, my confidence in navigating emergencies. Alone, the roads will be impassable by evening if this keeps up, I said. You might want to think about staying the night. I tried to keep my voice neutral, but inside my heart was doing something complicated. Part hope, part terror. The thought of having them in the house overnight, of falling asleep and waking up knowing I wasn't alone, was both thrilling and terrifying. What if we ran out of things to say? What if the awkwardness became unbearable. What if I discovered that 12 years had changed us into people who couldn't coexist in the same space? Nadine looked trapped, the same expression she'd worn as a teenager when weather had interfered with her carefully laid plans. She'd always been someone who needed control over her environment, who got anxious when circumstances forced her to adapt or improvise. "We should probably call your family," she said to Colin. "Let them know we might not make it tomorrow." "Already done," he said, holding up his phone. "I texted my mom while you two were talking. She says the important thing is that we're safe. I found myself liking Colin more with each passing hour. He had an easy adaptability that complemented Nadine's rigid planning, a calm presence that seemed to steady her anxiety. It reminded me of how Ray and I had balanced each other, his steady pragmatism smoothing out my tendency toward worry. "What's your family like?" I asked him, partly from genuine curiosity, and partly to fill the silence that kept threatening to overwhelm us. His face lit up in a way that told me this was safe territory for him. "Big," he said with a laugh. "I'm the youngest of 5 kids. My parents have been married 42 years, and Sunday dinners at their house are basically controlled chaos. Everyone talks over everyone else, and there are always at least 3 different conversations happening at once." I tried to imagine such a scene. A house full of voices and laughter, multiple generations gathered around one table, the comfortable mayhem of a large family. It sounded both wonderful and exhausting. "My mom still insists on cooking for everyone," Colin continued. "Even though we're all adults with our own families now, she makes enough food to feed an army, and then she sends everyone home with leftovers." "That sounds lovely," I said, and meant it. There was something appealing about that kind of abundance, that assumption that there would always be enough. Enough food, enough room, enough love to go around. "It is," Colin said. "Sometimes overwhelming, but lovely. I didn't realize how unusual it was until I got older and met people whose families were different." His eyes flicked to Nadine, and I saw her jaw tighten slightly. She'd always been sensitive about our small family unit, especially when she was in high school and spending time with friends who had siblings and extended family networks. I remembered her asking once why she didn't have any aunts or uncles or cousins, and the difficult conversation that followed about Ray's only brother, who died in Vietnam, and my sister who'd moved to California and gradually drifted out of our lives. "Different how?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Quieter," Colin said diplomatically. "More reserved." Reserved. It was a kind way of describing what I now recognized as emotional distance, the careful way Ray and I had moved through our marriage and family life. We'd loved each other deeply, but we'd never been demonstrative people. Affection was shown through actions rather than words, through reliability rather than passion. I thought about those Sunday dinners Colin had described, the easy intimacy of family members who could talk over each other without giving offense, who gathered regularly not out of obligation, but out of genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Had we ever had that? Had there ever been a time when our small family generated that kind of warmth and connection? There had been moments, I remembered. Christmas mornings when Nadine was little, racing down the stairs to see what Santa had brought. Summer evenings on the front porch, sharing a bowl of ice cream and watching the fireflies emerge. The 3 of us working together in the garden, Ray teaching Nadine to distinguish between weeds and vegetables, while I planned the next season's plantings. But those moments had been islands in an ocean of routine, of the careful politeness that had characterized our family dynamic. We'd been loving, but not particularly joyful, Close, but not especially intimate. I wondered if that was why Nadine had left so readily. Why she'd found it easy to build a life that didn't include us. Maybe what we'd called love had felt more like duty to her. "I should show you to your rooms," I said, standing up. "If you're going to stay, you'll want to get settled." The plural was automatic, and I saw Nadine's eyebrows rise slightly. Of course, she wouldn't be sharing a room with Colin under my roof. Some habits of propriety die hard, even when your daughter is 36 years old and engaged to be married. "That's not necessary," Colin said quickly. "I can sleep on the couch." "Nonsense," I said. "We have a guest room, and Nadine's old room is exactly as she left it." The words came out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted the revelation. Admitting that I'd preserved her childhood bedroom like a shrine was too much honesty, too much evidence of the hope I'd carried for 12 years. But Nadine didn't look embarrassed or uncomfortable. Instead, her expression softened with something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. I led them upstairs, the wooden steps creaking under our feet in a rhythm I knew by heart. The hallway was narrow, lined with family, photos that chronicled Nadine's progression from baby to teenager. There she was in first grade, grinning toothlessly at the camera. There she was at her 8th grade graduation, already showing signs of the serious young woman she'd become. There she was at high school prom, beautiful in a midnight blue dress that had taken me 3 trips to the mall to find. Colin stopped in front of the prom photo. "You looked amazing," he told Nadine, and I saw her smile in a way that reminded me of the girl in the picture. "I felt like a princess that night," she admitted. "Mom spent hours on my hair." I remembered that evening, the careful ritual of curling and pinning. The two of us standing in front of my bedroom mirror while I tried to create the elaborate updo she'd seen in a magazine. Ray had taken dozens of photos, muttering about how grown up she looked, how time moved too fast. "Here's the guest room," I said, opening the door to the small bedroom at the end of the hall. It had been my sewing room for years, but I'd always kept a bed in there for the occasional visitor who never came. The room was clean but impersonal, decorated in neutral colors that wouldn't offend anyone's taste. "This is perfect," Colin said. "Thank you." Nadine's room was across the hall, and I hesitated with my hand on the doorknob. Opening this door felt like revealing too much, like admitting how desperately I'd clung to the past. But I turned the handle anyway, and we stepped into a time capsule. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The black furniture she'd painted during her Gothic phase, the bookshelves lined with young adult novels, and textbooks from classes she'd never need again, the desk where she'd spent countless hours on homework and college applications. The walls were still covered with posters of bands I'd never heard of, and actors whose names I'd forgotten. And on the bed, folded at the foot, was the quilt I'd made for her 13th birthday. I'd forgotten it was there, had stopped noticing it during my weekly cleaning visits to this room. But seeing it now, with Nadine standing beside me, I remembered every stitch. The pattern was called Dancing Stars, dozens of tiny fabric triangles arranged in intricate geometric designs. I'd chosen colors I thought she'd love, deep purples and midnight blues, with silver accents that caught the light. It had taken me 8 months to complete, working in the evenings after she'd gone to bed, and Ray was grading papers. My fingers had been sore from the detailed piecing, but I'd persevered because I wanted her to have something special, something made with love that would last her whole life. Nadine walked over to the bed and touched the quilt with careful fingers, as if it might disintegrate at her touch. "You kept this too," she said, and her voice was smaller than it had been downstairs. "Of course I kept it," I said. "I made it for you." She picked up a corner of the quilt and examined the tiny, precise stitches, the careful way each piece of fabric had been joined to create the larger pattern. "I remember when you were working on this. You'd sit in the living room every night, and I could hear the sound of your needle going through the fabric." I'd thought she'd been too absorbed in her teenage world to notice, but apparently she'd been paying attention in ways I hadn't realized. "I always meant to take it to college," she said. "But I wanted to seem independent, sophisticated. A homemade quilt felt too childish." "It would have gotten ruined in a dorm room anyway," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "No," she said firmly. "I should have taken it. I should have been proud of it, proud that my mother had made something so beautiful for me." The admission caught me off guard, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. For 12 years I'd wondered if she'd valued any of the things I'd done for her, if she'd carried any piece of our life together into her independent adulthood. "There are others," I said. "In the closet. The one I made for your high school. Graduation. The baby quilt I started when I thought you might have children someday." I hadn't meant to mention the baby quilt, but the words slipped out. It was perhaps the most presumptuous thing I'd ever made. A tiny quilt in gender-neutral, yellows and greens, anticipating grandchildren who might never arrive, preparing for a future that might never include me. "You made a baby quilt?" Nadine asked. "It was presumptuous," I said quickly. I hope that someday." "Can I see it?" I opened the closet door and pulled out the cedar chest where I stored finished quilts. The baby quilt was on top, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. I unfolded it carefully, revealing the miniature perfection of tiny pieced blocks, arranged in a pattern called Baby's Breath. Colin whistled softly. "That's incredible," he said. "The detail is amazing." Nadine took the quilt from me, holding it up to examine the delicate stitching. It was small enough to drape across her arms, designed for a crib or a toddler's bed. "When did you make this?" she asked. "A few years ago," I admitted. "I kept thinking that maybe someday you'd call and tell me you were expecting, and I wanted to be ready." It was perhaps the most honest thing I'd said all day. This admission that I'd spent years preparing for a reconciliation that might never come, creating gifts for grandchildren I might never meet. Nadine sat down on the edge of her childhood bed, still holding the baby quilt. "We've been talking about children," she said quietly. "Colin wants them, and I think I do too. But I wasn't sure how to be a mother when I don't really know how to be a daughter." The words hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that reminded me of the little girl who used to climb into my lap when she was scared or confused. For the first time since she'd arrived, I saw past the successful, composed woman she'd become to the uncertain, young person underneath. "Being a mother is mostly improvisation," I said. "You do the best you can with what you know, and you hope it's enough." "Was I enough?" she asked, and the question broke my heart because I could hear the little girl in it, the child who'd never been quite sure of her place in the world. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, sitting down beside her on the bed. "You were everything. You were the best thing your father and I ever did." For a moment we sat there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the artifacts of her childhood, holding the quilt I'd made for children she might have someday. It felt like the closest we'd been in 20 years, this quiet moment of honesty in the room where she'd grown up. Then her phone buzzed and the spell was broken. She checked it automatically, her attention immediately shifting to whatever message had arrived. Sorry, she said, putting the phone away. Work crisis. But the moment was lost, and we were back to being the careful strangers we'd become. Connected by blood but separated by years of silence and the lives we'd built apart from each other. Downstairs, I heard the front door open and Dorothy's voice calling out, "Irene, I saw the car in the driveway and wanted to make sure you were all right in this storm." Of course, Dorothy would check on me. She had a sixth sense about when I might need company or assistance, and a house full of strangers during a snowstorm definitely qualified as an unusual situation requiring investigation. "That's my neighbor," I explained to Colin and Nadine. "Dorothy, she's persistent." "Irene?" Dorothy called again, and I could hear her stamping snow off her boots in the mudroom. "Coming," I called back, grateful for the interruption and the excuse to retreat from the emotional intensity of Nadine's childhood bedroom. As we headed downstairs, I caught Nadine carefully folding the baby quilt and placing it back in the tissue paper. She didn't put it back in the cedar chest, though. Instead, she set it on top of her dresser, where she could see it. It was a small gesture, but it felt like progress. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dorothy was waiting in the kitchen when we came downstairs, her coat still on but her boots neatly lined up by the door. She had that look on her face, the one she got when she sensed drama and was determined to insert herself into it, ostensibly to help, but really because she couldn't stand to miss anything interesting. "Well," she said, taking in the scene with shrewd eyes. "So, this must be Nadine." There was something in her tone that made me wince. Dorothy had heard 12 years' worth of my careful silences about my daughter, had witnessed my hurt and loneliness during holidays and birthdays, had been the one to hold my hand through the worst of the grief that followed Nadine's departure. She was fiercely protective of me, and I could tell she wasn't prepared to be immediately charmed by the daughter who'd abandoned me. "Dorothy, this is Nadine and her fiancé Colin," I said quickly. "They're staying the night because of the storm." "How convenient," Dorothy said, and the word convenient carried enough weight to sink a ship. Nadine's back straightened, and I recognized the defensive posture she'd adopted as a teenager whenever she felt judged or criticized. "It's nice to meet you," she said with careful politeness. "I'm sure it is," Dorothy replied, and I knew I needed to intervene before this got any worse. "Dorothy, why don't you sit down? I'll make fresh coffee." But Dorothy was on a mission. She settled into her usual chair at the kitchen table and fixed Nadine with the kind of stare she'd perfected during 40 years of teaching elementary school. 12 years, she said conversationally. "That's how long it's been since you've visited your mother. I've been keeping track." "Dorothy," I said sharply, but she waved me off. "Oh, hush, Irene. Someone needs to say it. 12 years of Christmas mornings when I've had to watch you set out 2 plates instead of 1, pretending you weren't hoping she'd show up. 12 years of birthday cakes you've baked for no one. Mother's Days when you've spent the whole day in bed because it hurt too much to get up." I felt my face burn with embarrassment. These were private shames I'd never meant for Nadine to know about. Evidence of the pathetic hope I'd carried like a secret wound. "Dorothy, please," I said. But Nadine was staring at me, and there was something in her expression I couldn't read. "You still made birthday cakes?" "It's nothing," I said quickly. "Dorothy's exaggerating." "I most certainly am not," Dorothy said, indignantly. "Every year, Chocolate with vanilla frosting. Just like when you were little. She'd make the whole cake, light the candles, and then sit there looking at it until I came over and made her throw it away. The silence that followed was excruciating. Colin looked like he wanted to disappear, and Nadine's face had gone very pale. "Mom," she said quietly, "you didn't need to—" "Don't," I said more sharply than I intended. "Just don't. Dorothy shouldn't have said anything." But Dorothy wasn't finished, and don't get me started on how she drove herself nearly to exhaustion, taking care of your father at the end, hoping that maybe if she was the perfect caregiver, the perfect wife, you'd forgive her for whatever imaginary sin she thought she'd committed. "It wasn't imaginary," Nadine said, and there was heat in her voice now. She gave up on him, when he could have fought harder, could have tried more aggressive treatments. She just let him die. The words hit me like a physical blow. After 12 years, there it was. The accusation I'd been dreading, the wound that had never healed, the reason my daughter had walked out of my life and never looked back. "I didn't let him die," I said, my voice shaking. "I respected his wishes." "His wishes?" Nadine stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Or your wishes. Maybe you were just tired of taking care of him. Maybe it was easier to give up than to fight." Colin reached for her arm. "Nadine, maybe we should—" "No," she said, shaking him off. "This needs to be said. Do you know what it was like watching her make decisions about his care like she was the only one who mattered? Like I didn't have a say in whether my own father lived or died? I felt 12 years of suppressed hurt and anger rising in my chest, like floodwater." "You weren't there," I said. "You visited twice in 6 months. Twice. You don't get to judge decisions you weren't here to help make." "Because you made it clear I wasn't welcome," Nadine shot back. "Every time I tried to talk to the doctors, you'd interrupt. Every time I suggested a different treatment, you'd shut me down. You acted like he was yours alone. Like being married to him gave you the right to decide everything." "I was his wife." The words came out louder than I'd intended, raw with 12 years of accumulated pain. "I was the one who held his hand through every chemo session, who cleaned up when he was too sick to make it to the bathroom, who watched him waste away to nothing while you were in Boston building your career." Dorothy was watching this exchange with wide eyes, but she didn't try to intervene. Colin looked stricken, caught between his loyalty to Nadine and his obvious discomfort with the cruelty of our words. "I had a job," Nadine said. "I had responsibilities. I couldn't just drop everything and move home." "You could have visited more," I said. "You could have called. You could have been present for the decisions instead of swooping in at the last minute with demands and accusations." "I was trying to save his life." "He didn't want to be saved." The words tore out of me with a violence that surprised us both. He was tired, Nadine. He was in pain every single day, and the treatments weren't working. The doctors said there was a 5% chance the experimental protocol would give him another 6 months, and those months would be agony. He asked me, begged me, to let him go with dignity. Nadine's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the lost little girl she'd been when her grandfather died, when she was 8. "But we could have tried. We could have fought harder. Some fights can't be won," I said more gently, "and some victories aren't worth the cost." She sank back into her chair, and I saw her hands were shaking. I needed more time with him. I needed to tell him things, to fix things between us. I wasn't ready to let him go. The admission broke my heart because I recognized the truth in it. Nadine had been struggling with her relationship with Ray for years before he got sick. The inevitable friction between a strong-willed daughter and a father who'd never quite figured out how to connect with her. They'd loved each other deeply, but hadn't known how to bridge the gap between his practical, reserved nature and her emotional intensity. "He knew you loved him," I said softly. "He was so proud of you, even if he didn't always know how to show it." "Then why didn't you fight for more time?" she asked, and her voice was small and broken. "Why didn't you give us the chance to fix things?" "Because I loved him too," I said. "And sometimes love means letting go, even when it's the hardest thing in the world." Dorothy cleared her throat gently. "Maybe I should leave you two to talk," she said. But neither Nadine nor I responded. We were locked in this moment of painful honesty, finally saying the things we should have said 12 years ago. Colin moved to stand behind Nadine's chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. "I think," he said carefully, "that you both did it, what you thought was right at the time, with the information you had, with the impossible situation you were facing. But it destroyed us," Nadine said. "This family, whatever we were, it all fell apart. Not all of it," I said, looking around the kitchen that had remained unchanged, the house that had waited for her return. "Some things survive, even when we think they can't." Nadine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. She'd done that as a little girl when she was trying not to cry, when she was determined to be brave, even when the world felt too big and scary. "I found something," she said suddenly. "When I was looking through Dad's desk for insurance papers after the funeral. I should have given it to you then, but I was so angry." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. My name was written on the front in Ray's careful handwriting. "I've been carrying this around for 12 years, she said, reading it when I missed him, when I was angry at you. When I was trying to understand why everything went so wrong, I took the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper was hospital. Stationery. I recognized the letterhead from Ray's final stay. Inside was a single sheet covered with his handwriting, shaky but still legible. "My dearest Irene," it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment to collect myself. "My dearest Irene, if you're reading this, then the decisions we talked about have been made, and I hope you're not carrying guilt that isn't yours to bear. I know how Nadine will react to my choice to stop treatment. I know she'll blame you, and I know you'll let her, because that's the kind of woman you are, the kind who takes on everyone else's pain to spare them from carrying it themselves. But I need you to know that this was my choice, made with a clear mind and a heart full of gratitude for the years we've had together. I'm not giving up. I'm choosing dignity over desperation, peace over pointless suffering. And I'm asking you to help me make that choice because I trust you to love me enough to let me go. Nadine will be angry because she needs someone to blame, and anger is easier than grief. She'll probably stop speaking to you for a while, maybe a long while. My heart breaks, knowing that my death might cost you your daughter. But I also know that if anyone can carry that burden with grace, it's you. Tell her, when she's ready to hear it, that I understand her anger. Tell her that I love her more than she knows, and that some of my proudest moments as a father were watching her become the strong, independent woman she is. Tell her that I'm sorry we ran out of time to say all the things we should have said to each other. And tell yourself, every day if you have to, that you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me 45 years of love and partnership, and the kind of happiness most men only dream of. You gave me a daughter who carries the best parts of both of us into the world. You gave me a death with dignity when I couldn't find the courage to ask for it myself. Don't let grief make you smaller, my love. Don't let Nadine's anger convince you that you failed us somehow. You were perfect, are perfect, exactly as you are. All my love, always Ray. I finished reading through a blur of tears, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the paper. 12 years. For 12 years I'd carried the weight of Nadine's accusations, had wondered if I'd been selfish, if I'd given up too easily, if love should have meant fighting harder regardless of the cost. He wrote this 3 days before he died. Nadine said quietly, I found it in the stack of papers he'd left for you, mixed in with insurance documents and bank statements. I read it, and I was so angry that he'd absolved you of everything, that he'd made you the hero of his story, while I was just the difficult daughter who couldn't accept reality. Why didn't you give it to me then? I asked. Because I wasn't ready to forgive you. Because I needed someone to blame, and if it wasn't you, then it had to be me, and that felt worse somehow. Dorothy was crying now too, her hand pressed to her mouth. Even Colin's eyes were wet as he stood behind Nadine's chair, bearing witness to this excavation of old grief. I'm sorry, Nadine said, and her voice was barely a whisper. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was wrong about so many things. You were grieving, I said. We both were. Grief makes us do terrible things sometimes. But 12 years, she said. 12 years of silence, of letting you carry all, of this alone, of missing birthdays and holidays and all the little moments that make up a life. I can't get that back? No, I agreed. But we can decide what happens next. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen since she was a child. Hope, tentative and fragile, but unmistakably there. I want to try, she said. I want to find a way back to being your daughter, if you'll let me. You never stopped being my daughter, I said. Even when I thought I'd lost you forever, you were still mine. Dorothy stood up quietly and moved toward the door. I should go, she said. Let you all have some privacy. But before she left, she stopped next to my chair and squeezed my shoulder. About time, she whispered in my ear. I was starting to think you were both too stubborn to ever figure it out. As the door closed behind her, the four of us sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling around us like snow. There was still so much to work through, so many years of hurt and misunderstanding to unpack. But for the first time in 12 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. The possibility of forgiveness, of healing, of finding our way back to each other. The manila folder still sat on the table between us, the mortgage papers a reminder of the practical matter that had brought Nadine home. But somehow, it seemed less important now, overshadowed by the larger questions of what we owed each other and what kind of family we might still become. The silence that followed Dorothy's departure felt different, charged with possibility instead of weighted with avoidance. Ray's letter lay on the table between us, the paper soft from years of handling, its words having finally served their purpose after 12 years of waiting. Colin cleared his throat gently. I should probably give you two some privacy to talk, he said, starting to rise. No, Nadine said quickly, reaching for his hand. Stay, please. I need... She paused, struggling with words. I need you to understand where I came from. Why I've been so afraid of needing anyone. She turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't seen since she was very young. Vulnerability without the armor of anger or professional composure. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. "About why I really came home now. Why the timing of this house suddenly became so urgent." My stomach tightened. After Ray's letter, after our confrontation about his death, I wasn't sure I could handle another revelation, another layer of complexity to untangle. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with the BRCA gene mutation, she said quietly. "The same, one that killed Grandma Ruth." The words hit me like cold water. My mother had died of breast cancer when Nadine was 15, a brutal battle that lasted 2 years and left scars on all of us. Ruth had been only 62, vibrant and seemingly healthy until the cancer appeared with vicious suddenness. The genetic counselor said I have an 87% chance of developing breast cancer by age 70, Nadine continued, and a 43% chance of ovarian cancer. They're recommending prophylactic surgery, a double mastectomy, and having my ovaries removed. I felt the blood drain from my face. "When?" "This spring. After the wedding." She twisted her engagement ring, the gesture I now recognized as her way of managing anxiety. "The doctors want me to have children first, if I'm going to have them at all. The hormone changes from removing my ovaries will make pregnancy difficult or impossible." The pieces began falling into place. The urgency about the house, the pressure, to move quickly, the way she'd held the baby quilt upstairs with such careful reverence. "That's why you need the house now," I said. "You're planning to start a family immediately." "We've been trying for 6 months," Colin said gently. "The genetic counselor said we shouldn't wait. If Nadine's going to have biological children, it needs to happen soon." I stared at my daughter, seeing her with completely new eyes. This successful, independent woman who'd seemed so in control of her destiny was actually racing against a genetic time bomb, making desperate plans to create the life she wanted before her body betrayed her the way it had betrayed my mother. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because I didn't know how," she said. "How do you call someone you haven't spoken to in 12 years and say, 'Hi, I might be dying, want to be involved in my life now?' It felt like emotional blackmail." "So you came with the mortgage papers instead." "I came with something practical, something that would benefit both of us. You'd get to see me, spend time with me, maybe meet your potential grandchildren. I'd get the financial help I needed to buy a house suitable for a family." She looked down at her hands. "I told myself it was a business transaction because that felt safer than admitting I was scared and needed my mother. The manipulation of it should have made me angry, but instead I felt a crushing wave of sadness. My daughter had been carrying this terrifying diagnosis alone, making life-altering decisions without the support system that families are supposed to provide. "You've been dealing with this by yourself," I said. "Not by herself," Colin said firmly. "She has me. She has my family, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There are some things you need your mother for, and I think, deep down, she knew that." Nadine was crying now, tears streaming down her face in a way that reminded me of when she was small and had scraped her knee or lost a treasured toy. "I was so scared you'd say no," she whispered. "Not about the mortgage. I knew you might refuse that. But I was terrified you'd refuse to be part of our lives, that 12 years of silence had killed whatever love you had left for me." I moved to the chair beside her and pulled her into my arms the way I had when she was little, and the world felt too big and frightening. She came willingly, all her adult composure dissolving as she pressed her face against my shoulder. "I could never stop loving you," I said into her hair, which smelled like expensive shampoo and still carried the faintest hint of the strawberry detangler I'd used when she was young. Even when I was angry, even when I felt abandoned, I never stopped being your mother. I know that now, she said against my shoulder. Reading Dad's letter, seeing how you've kept everything exactly the same, the birthday cakes Dorothy mentioned. I know you never gave up on me, but I gave up on us, and I don't know how to forgive myself for that. The same way I'm learning to forgive myself for Ray's death, I said, one day at a time, with help from people who love us. We held each other for a long moment, and I felt something shift between us. Not a complete healing, but the beginning of one. The first tentative steps toward becoming mother and daughter, again instead of two women, bound only by shared history and mutual hurt. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clearer than they'd been since she arrived. "There's more," she said, "about the house, about why it had to be that particular one." She reached for the real estate brochure that had been sitting forgotten among the mortgage papers. "Look at the address," she said. I looked more closely at the elegant script beneath the photographs. 847 Lakeshore Drive. The number meant nothing to me at first, but then I saw the way Nadine was watching my face, waiting for recognition. 847? I said slowly. "That was Grandma Ruth's house number, wasn't it? On Maple Street." "She always talked about wanting to live on the water," Nadine said. "Remember, she'd say that someday. When Grandpa retired, they'd buy a little cottage on a lake and watch the sunrise every morning." I did remember. My mother had been a dreamer in ways that my practical father found both charming and impractical. She'd collected pictures of lakefront cottages from magazines, creating elaborate fantasies about the life she'd live if money and circumstances were different. She died before she could do any of the things she really wanted, Nadine continued, before she could travel, or live by the water, or see her granddaughter get married and have children. The cancer took all of that away from her. "So you're buying the house she never could," I said, understanding. "I'm trying to live the life she didn't get to have, and I want my children, our children, to grow up somewhere beautiful, somewhere that honors her memory and the time we might not have." The weight of this revelation settled over me like a blanket. My daughter wasn't just planning for her future. She was racing to fulfill the dreams of 3 generations of women, carrying forward the hopes and aspirations that cancer had cut short for my mother. "That's why the timing matters so much," Colin said. "It's not just about the mortgage approval or the seller's deadline. Nadine wants to be settled before she starts the surgeries, wants to have a home base that feels permanent and safe. I want to have at least one Christmas in that house before—" Nadine's voice trailed off, but I understood. Before the surgeries that would change her body forever. Before the possibility of cancer became a reality. Before time ran out the way it had for Ruth. "You should have told me all of this from the beginning," I said. "I should have told you a lot of things," she agreed. "But I didn't know how to be vulnerable with you anymore. I'd forgotten how." I looked at the mortgage papers with new eyes, seeing them not as a transaction but as a desperate attempt to build something lasting in the face of uncertainty. My signature wouldn't just be guaranteeing a loan. It would be investing in my daughter's race against genetics, supporting her attempt to create the family and home she might not have time to build gradually. "The house," I said. "It's not just about having a place to live, is it? It's about creating something permanent before everything becomes uncertain." "Yes," she said simply. "And I need you to be part of it. Not just as a co-signer, but as my mother, as their grandmother, if we're lucky enough to have children. The magnitude of what she was asking hit me fully for the first time. She wasn't just requesting financial help. She was inviting me back into her life at the moment when that life had become most precious and most precarious. The evening stretched ahead of us like uncharted territory. After the emotional revelations of the afternoon, we'd all retreated to separate corners of the house. Colin to the guest room to make phone calls to his family, Nadine to her childhood bedroom to rest, and me to the living room where I sat, with Ray's letter in my lap, reading it again and again as if repetition might help me absorb the full weight of his words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the familiar landscape into something ethereal and strange. The storm had become a gift of sorts, forcing us to remain in the same space, to confront the truths we'd spent 12 years avoiding. Without the weather trapping us here, Nadine might have delivered her mortgage papers and departed again, leaving the deeper wounds unexamined. But now I knew about the genetic time bomb ticking in her cells, about her desperate race to create the family she might not have time to build slowly. I knew about her connection to my mother's unfulfilled dreams, about the weight of generational expectations she was carrying. Most importantly, I knew that beneath her professional success and apparent self-sufficiency, she was still the frightened little girl who needed her mother's love and approval. The question now was what to do with all this knowledge. I found myself thinking about the early years of my marriage, when the future had seemed so full of possibility. Ray and I had been young and optimistic, convinced that love and hard work could overcome any obstacle. We'd made plans together, for his career, for my return to teaching, for the children we'd have, and the life we'd build. Those plans had required constant revision as reality intruded. My teaching dreams had been deferred, then abandoned, then resurrected years later, only to be set aside again when Ray got sick. I'd told myself that sacrifice was love, that putting everyone else's needs before my own was what good wives and mothers did. But had it been love, or had it been fear? Fear of being seen as selfish, fear of disappointing people, fear of claiming space for my own ambitions and desires. I stood up, Ray's letter still in my hand, and walked to the small desk, in the corner of the living room where I kept household records and correspondence. In the bottom drawer, beneath bank statements and insurance policies, was a collection of journals I'd kept over the years. Not daily diaries, but occasional repositories for thoughts too complex or private to share. I pulled out the oldest one, a simple composition notebook with a marbled cover that I'd bought in 1972, when Nadine was 2 years old, and I was struggling with the decision to abandon my plans for graduate school. I hadn't looked at it in years, but something about the day's revelations made me want to revisit that younger version of myself. The pages were yellowed with age, my handwriting smaller and more careful than it was now. I flipped through entries about Nadine's developmental milestones, Ray's progress in his master's program, the small domestic crises that had seemed so important at the time. Then I found the entry I was looking for, dated September 15th, 1972. I went to campus today to withdraw from the graduate program, I'd written. Dr. Matthews tried to convince me to defer for a year instead of dropping out entirely. But I know myself too well. If I don't go now, I never will. There will always be another reason to wait, another family need that takes precedence. Ray says he supports whatever decision I make, but I can see the relief in his eyes when I talk about staying home with Nadine. He needs me to be the stable one, the one who handles the domestic details so he can focus on his career. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being the foundation that allows other people to soar is its own kind of achievement. But I dream sometimes about the classroom I'll never have, The students I'll never teach, the ideas I'll never get to explore. I wonder if I'll regret this choice when I'm old, if I'll look back and feel like I wasted the gifts I was given. Mother called today to ask about my decision. When I told her I was withdrawing from school, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I hope you're not making the same mistake I did." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "I gave up too much of myself to be the woman everyone else needed me to be. Don't disappear completely, Irene. Make sure there's still something left of you when everyone else is done taking what they need." I closed the journal, my heart pounding. My mother's words, forgotten for 50 years, echoed across the decades with startling relevance. She'd been warning me about the very pattern I'd fallen into. The slow erosion of self in service of others, the gradual transformation from person to function. Had I made the same mistake she had? Had I taught Nadine, through my example, that women were supposed to be selfless, that our worth came from how much we were willing to sacrifice? And if so, was that why she'd fled so completely? Why she'd built a life that deliberately excluded the people who might make demands on her time? And energy? The irony was painful. In trying to be the perfect wife and mother, I might have driven away the very people I was trying to serve. I heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see Nadine coming down, her hair damp from a shower and her face scrubbed clean of makeup. Without the professional armor of her earlier appearance, she looked younger, more vulnerable. "Couldn't sleep," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Too much to think about. I know the feeling," I said, closing the journal and setting it aside. She noticed the movement. "What's that?" "An old journal, from when you were little and I was trying to decide whether to go back to school." I paused, considering how much to share. "I was remembering something your grandmother said to me about not losing myself in service to everyone else." "Grandma Ruth was wise," Nadine said. "I think about her a lot these days, especially since the diagnosis. She was only 62 when she died, younger than you are now. She had so many plans," I said. "Things she wanted to do when she retired, places she wanted to travel. She was always saying, 'Someday,' and 'when I have time.' The cancer took all her somedays away." "Is that why you kept teaching after Dad got sick? Because you didn't want to end up with nothing but regrets?" The question was perceptive, cutting right to the heart of something I'd never fully acknowledged. "Partly," I admitted, "but also because I'd already given up so much. Teaching was the one thing I'd managed to reclaim for myself, and I wasn't ready to let it go again." "Even though it meant less time with Dad?" "Even though it meant less time with Dad," I confirmed. "And I think that's part of why you were so angry with me. You saw me prioritizing my career over his care, and it felt like another betrayal." Nadine was quiet for a moment, processing this. "I always thought you were the most selfless person I knew," she said finally. "It never occurred to me that you might have your own dreams, your own needs that weren't being met." "I didn't want you to see that," I said. "I thought being a good mother meant making it look effortless, making it seem like taking care of you, and your father was all I ever wanted to do. But it wasn't. It was part of what I wanted to do, a big part, but not the only part." I looked at her, this adult daughter who was still trying to understand the woman who'd raised her. "I loved being your mother, Nadine. I loved teaching you to read and helping with your homework, and watching you grow into the remarkable woman you became. But I also missed having my own identity, my own professional accomplishments to be proud of." "Is that why you went back to teaching when I was in high school?" "Yes. And it's why I kept teaching even when your father got sick, even when you thought I should be home with him every minute. I'd spent 18 years being primarily a wife and mother, and I wasn't ready to disappear completely into those roles again. She absorbed this, and I could see her reconsidering events from our past through this new lens. So when you made the decision to stop Dad's treatments, you were thinking about more than just his wishes? I was thinking about the kind of death he wanted, yes. But I was also thinking about the kind of life I wanted to have after he was gone. I didn't want to spend my remaining years consumed by guilt and regret, wondering if I'd done enough or fought hard enough or loved him properly. And I made you feel guilty anyway. You were grieving, I said gently. Grief makes us cruel sometimes. We lash out at the people closest to us because they're safe targets, because we know they'll still love us even when we're at our worst. But 12 years of silence wasn't grief, she said. That was something else. That was me being too proud to admit I was wrong, too scared to face the possibility that I'd destroyed our relationship forever. I reached over and took her hand, noting how soft her skin was, how different her hands looked from mine, manicured and smooth where mine were spotted with age and rough from years of housework and gardening. You didn't destroy anything that can't be rebuilt, I said. But we both have to want to do the work. I do want to, she said quickly. I want to find a way back to being a family, whatever that looks like now. I want my children to know their grandmother, to have the kind of relationship with you that I threw away. Then we'll figure it out, I said. Together. She smiled then, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since she'd arrived. Does that mean you'll sign the mortgage papers? I looked at the manila folder still sitting on the kitchen table, at the legal documents that represented such an enormous financial risk for me. $850,000. If something went wrong, I could lose everything. This house, my savings, the security I'd spent a lifetime building. But I thought about Nadine's genetic diagnosis, about her race against time to build the family she wanted. I thought about my mother's unfulfilled dreams and the cottage on the water she'd never gotten to buy. I thought about the patterns of sacrifice and regret that had shaped 3 generations of women in our family. Yes, I said. I'll sign them. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having passed overnight and left the world transformed. Snow blanketed everything in pristine white, making the familiar landscape look like something from a fairy tale. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows was almost blinding as it reflected off the fresh snow, and for the first time in years, I felt like the metaphor was appropriate. We were all seeing everything with new clarity. Colin had been up early, shoveling the walkway and scraping snow off their car, with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to New England winters. Through the window, I watched him work and marveled at how naturally he'd inserted himself into our family drama, how he'd managed to be supportive without being intrusive, present without being overwhelming. Nadine sat at the kitchen table with the mortgage papers spread before her, reading through each page with the careful attention she probably gave to every contract in her professional life. But this wasn't just a business transaction anymore. We all understood that. This was a leap of faith, a bridge built from legal documents and signatures that would connect our separate lives in ways both practical and profound. Are you sure about this? She asked for the 3rd time since breakfast. It's a lot of money to risk on someone who's been such a terrible daughter. You haven't been a terrible daughter, I said, refilling her coffee cup. You've been a daughter who was hurt and angry, and didn't know how to find her way back home. That's different. She looked up at me, and I saw tears threatening again. The emotional exhaustion of the past 24 hours had stripped away her usual composure, left her raw and vulnerable in ways that reminded me of the little girl she'd once been. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "How to be someone's daughter again. How to let you into my life without it feeling like I'm giving up the independence I've worked so hard to build." "You don't have to give up your independence," I said, sitting down across from her. "Being part of a family doesn't mean losing yourself. I know that's what I modeled for you, the woman who disappears into her roles as wife and mother. But that was my mistake, not a requirement." Colin came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots and bringing the sharp scent of winter air with him. "Roads are clear," he reported. "We could drive back to Boston today if we wanted to." But none of us moved toward leaving. There was still something unfinished between us, some final piece of business that needed to be completed before we could move forward. "I keep thinking about what you said yesterday," Nadine said to me. "About love sometimes meaning letting go. I understand now why you made the choice you did about Dad's care. But I still don't understand how you let me go so easily. How you let 12 years pass without fighting for our relationship." The question hit me like a physical blow because it touched on my deepest shame, the failure I'd carried silently for over a decade, because I thought fighting would drive you further away. I said quietly, because I was terrified that if I pushed too hard, you'd cut me off completely, and I'd never have even the hope of reconciliation. So, you chose silence over the risk of rejection. I chose what felt like the safer path, I admitted. And in doing so, I probably taught you that I didn't value our relationship enough to fight for it. But you did fight for it, Colin said unexpectedly. Both Nadine and I turned to look at him. "You kept her room exactly as she left it. You made birthday cakes every year. You stayed connected to her life in the only ways you knew how." "That wasn't fighting," Nadine said. "That was just waiting." "Sometimes waiting is the most difficult kind of fighting there is," he replied. "Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to give up hope, even when hope feels foolish." I reached across the table and took Nadine's hand, noting again how different our hands looked, hers smooth and manicured, mine weathered by age and work. But they fit together the way they had when she was small and would slip her tiny hand into mine as we walked through town. "I should have called you," I said. "I should have written letters, sent birthday cards, found ways to stay connected even when you didn't respond. I should have been braver." "We both should have been braver," she said. "But maybe this is our chance to start over, to do it right this time." She pulled the mortgage application toward her and found the signature lines highlighted in yellow. "These papers," she said, "they're not really about the house, are they? They're about trust, about whether we believe in each other enough to take this risk together." I nodded, understanding that we'd moved beyond the practical details of interest rates and monthly payments into something much more fundamental. By signing these documents, I would be betting on our future relationship, investing not just money, but faith in the possibility that we could rebuild what we'd lost. "What if I can't be the daughter you want me to be?" she asked. "What if I'm too damaged by these 12 years apart, too set in my ways to change?" "What if I can't be the mother you need me to be?" I countered. "What if I'm too set in my patterns of sacrifice and silence to learn how to have a healthy relationship with my adult daughter?" Colin laughed softly. "What if you both just try to be yourselves and see what happens? What if you start from where you are instead of where you think you should be?" It was such simple advice, but it cut through the complexity of our fears and expectations with startling clarity. We didn't have to be perfect. We just had to be willing to try. I reached for the pen that lay beside the mortgage documents. "There's something I need to say before I sign this," I said. "Something I should have said 12 years ago." Nadine tensed, perhaps expecting another difficult revelation or painful confession. "I'm proud of you," I said simply. "I'm proud of the woman you've become, the career you've built, the life you've created for yourself. I'm proud that you had the courage to leave when staying felt impossible, and I'm proud that you have the courage to come back now, when it would be easier to stay away." She started crying then, the kind of deep, releasing tears that come when you've been holding your breath for years and finally remember how to exhale. "I needed to hear that," she whispered. "I've been waiting my whole life to hear that." "Then I should have said it sooner," I replied. "I should have said it every day." I signed my name carefully on each designated line, my signature looking small and slightly shaky next to the bold printed text of the legal document. But there was power in those loops and curves, in the act of committing myself legally and emotionally to my daughter's future. When I finished, I slid the papers back to Nadine. She added her own signature with the confidence of someone accustomed to signing important documents, but her hand trembled slightly as she wrote her name. "There," she said, setting down the pen. "We're officially in business together." But it felt like more than a business partnership. It felt like the beginning of something new, a family relationship built on choice rather than obligation, on mutual respect rather than duty. Colin pulled out his phone and held it up. "Can I take a picture?" "For posterity," we posed awkwardly, at first uncertain how to arrange ourselves. But then Nadine moved her chair closer to mine and put her arm around my shoulders. I leaned into her embrace, marveling at how natural it felt, despite the years of distance between us. "Say new beginnings," Colin said, and we both smiled, real smiles, not the careful, posed expressions we might have managed yesterday. The camera clicked, capturing a moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning. The end of 12 years of silence and estrangement. The beginning of whatever came next. As Colin reviewed the photo on his phone, Nadine turned to me with an expression of wonder. "I can't believe we actually did it," she said. "I can't believe you're really going to help us buy this house. I can't believe you really want me to be part of your life again," I replied. "I never stopped wanting that," she said softly. "I just didn't know how to ask." The mortgage papers lay between us on the table, our signatures binding us together, in ways both legal and emotional. $850,000 was a lot of money, more than I'd ever imagined spending on anything. But it wasn't really about the money anymore. It was about the lakefront house where my daughter would build her family, where my potential grandchildren would grow up with water views and sunrise mornings. It was about fulfilling my mother's unrealized dreams of living by the water, carrying forward the hopes of 3 generations of women. Most of all, it was about choosing love over fear, connection over safety, hope over the certainty of remaining alone. The documents would need to be notarized and filed, the loan would need to be processed, and there would be months of paperwork and financial scrutiny ahead. But the hardest part was done. We'd found our way back to each other, and that was worth any amount of money, any degree of risk. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Nadine's new lakefront home, watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink that would have made my mother weep with joy. The view was even more spectacular than the real estate photos had suggested. An endless expanse of Lake Champlain, stretching toward the mountains, dotted with early morning kayakers and the occasional loon breaking the surface. Nadine moved around her spacious kitchen with the efficiency of someone still learning the rhythms of a new space, preparing coffee in a machine that probably cost more than my first car. But her movements were relaxed, content in a way I hadn't seen since she was a child. "The baby quilt looks perfect in the nursery," she said, following my gaze toward the stairs that led to the second floor. "Right by the rocking chair where I can see it every time I nurse. 3 months pregnant. The news had come just 2 weeks after they'd closed on the house. A gift of timing that felt like a blessing from generations of women who'd waited too long for their dreams to come true. The genetic counselor had been cautiously optimistic. They'd caught the pregnancy early, and all the initial tests looked promising. "Have you thought about names?" I asked, accepting the mug of coffee she offered. "Ruth, if it's a girl," she said without hesitation. "Ruth, Irene. We want her to carry forward the strongest women in our family." My throat tightened with emotion. To have my name linked with my mother's, to be remembered in my granddaughter's identity, felt like an honor I hadn't dared hope for. Colin appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work, but moving with the unhurried pace of someone who lived. 40 minutes from the office instead of in the heart of a bustling city. The move to Vermont had been good for him, too. His freelance design business was thriving, and he'd found a community of artists and entrepreneurs who shared his values. "Morning, Irene," he said, kissing my cheek with the easy affection that had developed between us over the months. "Ready for your first official lake sunrise?" It had become our tradition. Whenever I stayed overnight, which happened about once a month now, we'd gather in the kitchen to watch the sunrise together. Sometimes we talked, working through the ongoing process of rebuilding our relationships. Sometimes we simply sat in comfortable silence, marveling at the beauty spread before us. Today, Colin pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "Early Christmas present," he said with a grin. "Since you'll be at Dorothy's for the actual holiday." I unwrapped it carefully, revealing a delicate glass ornament in the shape of a lakefront cottage. Inside the hollow center, tiny figures could be seen through the windows. A woman at a kitchen table, a man reading by a fireplace, a woman holding a baby. "It's us," Nadine explained softly. "Our new family, our new traditions. I thought you could hang it on your tree this year, and maybe next year we could start having Christmas here, all of us together." I turned the ornament in my hands, watching the light catch the glass and throw tiny rainbows across the kitchen walls. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was a promise, a commitment to building something new from the pieces of what we'd almost lost. "I'd like that very much," I said, pulling both of them into a hug that felt as natural as breathing. Through the kitchen window, the sunrise continued its daily resurrection, painting the world in hope and possibility. My daughter was home, not in the house where she'd grown up, but in the life she'd chosen to build. And I was part of it now, woven into the fabric of her days, not as the ghost of obligation, but as the welcome presence of love, freely given and gratefully received. Some stories don't end with perfect reconciliation, but ours was still being written, and for the first time in 12 years, I couldn't wait to see what came next. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.